Two attorneys boarded a flight out of Seattle, ready to settle in for the journey. One took the window seat, the other the middle. Just as they buckled in, a physician arrived and claimed the aisle seat beside them. He kicked off his shoes, wiggled his toes, and leaned back with a contented sigh. A few minutes later, the attorney by the window stretched and said, "I think I'll get up and grab a Coke." Before he could move, the physician smiled and said, "No need, I'll get it for you." As soon as the doctor walked away, the other attorney smirked, picked up one of the physician's shoes and spat inside it. His companion chuckled but said nothing. Moments later, the physician returned, handed over the Coke, and settled back into his seat. "That looks good," the second attorney said. "I think I'll have one too." "Of course," the physician replied cheerfully, standing up once more to fetch another drink. As soon as he disappeared down the aisle, the first attorney seized the opportunity, picked up the doctor's other shoe, and spat in it. When the physician returned with the second Coke, the attorneys sat back, sipping their drinks and exchanging satisfied glances. The flight continued without incident, and all seemed well. But as the plane descended for landing, the physician calmly slid his feet into his shoes. He barely flinched as he felt the dampness inside. Instead, he took a deep breath, looked straight ahead, and sighed. "How long?" he asked, shaking his head. "How long must this pointless war between our professions continue? The bitterness, the rivalry, the endless pranks." He paused dramatically before adding, "The spitting in shoes and the pissing in Cokes?" An old snake slithered into the doctor's office, his tongue flicking nervously. "Doc, I need help," he hissed. "My eyes aren't what they used to be. Everything's a blur these days." The doctor nodded sympathetically. "No worries. Let's get you some glasses and see if that helps." A few minutes later, the snake was fitted with a sleek new pair of spectacles. "Try these out," the doctor said. "Come back in 2 weeks and let me know how you're doing." 2 weeks passed, and the snake returned. But this time his scales seemed dull, his posture droopy. The doctor frowned. "What's wrong? Didn't the glasses help?" "Oh, they worked fine, Doc," the snake sighed. "Crystal clear vision." He shook his head in defeat. "Problem is, I just found out I've been living with a garden hose for the past 2 years." A nervous pig waddled into the doctor's office, his hooves clacking against the tile floor. His eyes were bloodshot and deep bags hung under them. "Doc, I need help," the pig groaned. "I can't sleep. Every night I have these horrible nightmares." The doctor leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Nightmares, you say? Tell me about them." "They're always the same," the pig whispered, shuddering. "It starts with a man. He lures me in with food, then—" He gulped. "Then he kills me, cuts me into pieces, and rubs salt all over my flesh." The doctor sat back in his chair, nodding thoughtfully. After a moment, he said, "Well, I wouldn't worry too much about it." The pig's ears perked up. "You think it's just stress?" The doctor smirked. "Not quite. I just think you're going to be cured very soon." Two doctors, Dr. Dean and Dr. Gable, sat across from a patient, reviewing his test results. The man coughed weakly, his breath labored. "Your lung condition is getting worse," Dr. Dean said, shaking his head. "The weed smoking isn't helping." The patient frowned. "But it's just herbal. How can something natural be bad for me?" Dr. Gable sighed. "Nature isn't as innocent as you think. Apricot stones contain lethal amounts of cyanide. There's a certain plant in my back garden. If you sit under it for just 5 minutes, you'll die." The patient's eyes widened. "Seriously?" "Dead serious," Dr. Gable replied. "Just because something is natural doesn't mean it's safe." The man gulped, nodding. "All right, I guess I should quit." He left, thoroughly convinced. Later that day, as the doctor sat down for lunch, Dr. Dean glanced at his colleague and asked, "By the way, what is that plant that kills you if you sit under it for 5 minutes?" Dr. Gable took a bite of his sandwich and casually replied, "A water lily." Deep in the countryside, a doctor traveled miles into the boondocks to deliver a baby. It was so far out there wasn't even electricity. When he finally arrived at the small wooden house, he found only the laboring mother and her wide-eyed 5-year-old son. With no one else around, the doctor turned to the boy and handed him a lantern. "Hold this up high so I can see what I'm doing," he instructed. The child nodded and gripped the lantern tightly, his little hands shaking with excitement. The mother pushed, the doctor worked, and after some effort, a tiny newborn entered the world. The doctor lifted the baby by the feet and gave him a firm pat on the bottom, coaxing out his first cry. He turned to the boy and smiled. "Well, what do you think of your new baby brother?" The child frowned, looking deeply unimpressed. After a moment of serious thought, he blurted out, "Hit him again! He shouldn't have crawled up there in the first place." An American, a Scot, and a Canadian were driving down a winding road when tragedy struck. A terrible accident sent their car skidding off the highway. The crash was fatal, and by the time they reached the emergency room, all three had been declared dead. But just as the doctors were about to place a toe tag on the American, he gasped, coughed, and opened his eyes. The room fell silent in shock. One of the doctors rushed forward. "You were gone. What happened?" The American took a deep breath and sat up. "Well," he began, "I remember the crash, and then this warm, beautiful light. The next thing I knew, the Canadian, the Scot, and I were standing at the gates of heaven." The doctors and nurses listened in awe as he continued. "St. Peter came up to us and said we were all too young to die. He told us there was a way to return to Earth, but it required a $50 donation." "So what did you do?" a nurse asked. The American shrugged. "I pulled out my wallet, handed over the $50, and bam, next thing I know, I'm back here." The doctors exchanged amazed glances. "Incredible! But what happened to the other two?" The American sighed. "Last I saw them, the Scot was still haggling over the price, and the Canadian was waiting for the government to cover his." A man lay in a hospital bed staring at the ceiling, nerves creeping in. He was about to become the first person in history to receive a brain transplant, a groundbreaking procedure that could change his life forever. Just then, the doctor walked in, a clipboard in hand and a cautious smile on his face. "Good news," the doctor said. "You've been approved for the transplant. But since this is a brand new procedure, your insurance won't cover the full cost. You'll have to choose from 3 different brains based on what you can afford." The man sat up slightly. "All right, what are my options?" The doctor flipped through his notes. "Well, first we have an engineer's brain. Highly logical, full of problem-solving skills. That'll cost you $100 an ounce." The man nodded. "Not bad. What else?" "Then there's an astrophysicist's brain, filled with deep knowledge of the universe, brilliant calculations. That one's $200 an ounce." The man raised an eyebrow. "Impressive. And the last option?" The doctor cleared his throat. "Finally, we have a politician's brain. That one's the most expensive. $1,000 an ounce." The man's jaw dropped. "What? That's ridiculous. Why is a politician's brain so expensive?" The doctor sighed and shook his head. "Sir, do you have any idea how many politicians it takes to get just 1 ounce of brain?" "Finding the right job isn't easy, and trust me, I've tried just about everything. My first gig was at an orange juice factory, but I got canned. Turns out I just couldn't concentrate. So I took a job in the woods as a lumberjack. Figured I'd give it a whack, but I just couldn't hack it. So they gave me the axe. Next, I tried my hand as a tailor. Thought I'd be cut out for it, but it was only a so-so job. Then, I worked at Starbucks, but I got tired of the same old grind. Hoping for something more flavorful, I became a chef. Thought it would add spice to my life. But turns out I just didn't have the time. So I moved on to a deli, but no matter how I sliced it, I just couldn't cut the mustard. Music seemed promising, so I became a musician. It was great, until I realized I wasn't very noteworthy. After years of studying, I even tried becoming a doctor. But in the end, I just didn't have any patience. Then came a shoe factory job. I tried hard to make it work, but I just didn't fit in. Fishing seemed peaceful, but I quickly discovered I couldn't live on my net income. Hoping for something different, I joined a pool maintenance company. But let me tell you, that work was just too draining. So I took a job at a gym. Figured I'd stay in shape while earning money. But they said I wasn't fit for the job. Then I thought I had finally found my calling as a historian, until I realized there was no future in it. My last attempt? A muffler factory. But that job was just too exhausting. So, after all those years of searching, I finally found the perfect job. Retirement. And you know what? I'm great at it. Dr. Peterson, a psychologist, was making his usual morning rounds at the hospital when he entered one of the patient's rooms. He stopped in his tracks, puzzled by the scene before him. One patient sat on the floor, vigorously moving his hand back and forth over a block of wood, as if he were sawing it in half. Meanwhile, another patient dangled upside down from the ceiling, his foot hooked onto a pipe, his face strained but determined. Dr. Peterson cleared his throat. "Good morning. May I ask, what exactly are you doing?" The patient on the floor huffed, clearly annoyed. "Isn't it obvious? I'm sawing this piece of wood in half." The doctor nodded slowly, then gestured toward the man hanging from the ceiling. "And what about him?" "Oh, that's my friend," the patient said casually. "But don't mind him. He's a little crazy. Thinks he's a light bulb." Dr. Peterson frowned. "Well, if he's your friend, shouldn't you get him down before he hurts himself?" The patient looked up, horrified. "What? And work in the dark?" One day, Pete groaned as he rubbed his temples. "Ugh, my head is killing me. I think I need to see a doctor." His friend Jake shook his head. "Don't waste your money. There's a computer at the drugstore that can diagnose anything, faster and cheaper than a doctor." Pete raised an eyebrow. "A computer?" "Yeah. Just tell it your symptoms, drop in a urine sample, and it'll give you an instant diagnosis. Only costs $20. Intrigued, Pete decided to give it a shot. He filled a jar with a urine sample and went straight to the drugstore. Sure enough, there stood a sleek, high-tech machine. He followed the instructions, poured in his sample, inserted a $20 bill, and waited. The machine whirred, flashed some lights, and then, ding, out popped a slip of paper. Diagnosis: you have migraines. Recommendation: take better care of yourself. Get proper rest, stay hydrated, and avoid bright lights and stress. See me again in 2 weeks. Pete was amazed. This thing actually works. But as the days passed, his curiosity got the better of him. Could this machine be fooled? Determined to test it, Pete came up with a plan. He mixed together some tap water, a stool sample from his dog urine from his wife and teenage daughter, a bit of oil from his car grinning. He returned to the drugstore and fed the bizarre concoction into the machine. He inserted another $20 bill and eagerly awaited the results. Once again, the machine whirred, beeped, flashed, then printed a new slip. Pete snatched it up and read, "Diagnosis: your tap water is contaminated with waste. Your dog has ringworms. Your teenage daughter is pregnant. Your wife has had 5 different lovers in the past 6 months. Your car needs a new radiator." And at the bottom, in bold letters, "And you wonder why you have a headache?" A small plane soared high above the clouds, carrying 5 passengers: an old man, a schoolboy, a lawyer, a doctor, and a community service worker. Everything was going smoothly until the pilot suddenly clutched his chest, let out a gasp, and collapsed over the controls. The plane lurched violently. The engine sputtered. Panic erupted. "We're going down!" someone shouted. As the passengers scrambled in fear, they discovered a grim reality. There were only 4 parachutes on board. With 5 people and 4 parachutes, a difficult decision had to be made. The community service worker wasted no time. "I must survive. I dedicate my life to helping vulnerable children and supporting families in crisis." He grabbed a parachute, strapped it on, and leaped out without another word. The lawyer stepped forward. "I deserve to live. My sharp wit and vast knowledge make me an invaluable advocate for justice." Without waiting for a response, he snatched the second parachute and jumped. The doctor adjusted his glasses. "I save lives. My medical expertise is critical to society." He grabbed a pack, secured it, and flung himself out into the sky. That left only the schoolboy and the old man. The elderly gentleman sighed, looking at the boy with kind eyes. "Go on, son. Take the last parachute. You have your whole life ahead of you. I've lived mine." But the schoolboy simply smiled. "It's okay, sir. We both get to live." The old man blinked. "What? But there were only 4 parachutes." The boy chuckled. "Nope. There are still 2 left." The old man's eyes widened. "But those 3—" He trailed off, realization dawning. The schoolboy grinned. "Remember the lawyer with the sharp wit and massive knowledge? He took my school backpack." One bright morning, a priest, a doctor, and an engineer were enjoying a round of golf when they found themselves stuck behind an excruciatingly slow group. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The trio sighed in frustration as the golfers ahead fumbled, missed shots, and took forever to move on. The engineer huffed, crossing his arms. "What's with these guys? We've been waiting for 25 minutes!" The doctor shook his head. I have no idea, but I've never seen such incompetence on a golf course. The priest, trying to stay composed, spotted the greenskeeper approaching and waved him down. George, good to see you. Say, do you know what's going on with the group ahead of us? They're painfully slow. George nodded solemnly. Oh, that's a group of blind firefighters. They lost their sight while saving our clubhouse from a fire last year. So, we let them play here anytime, free of charge. A heavy silence fell over the trio. The priest's face softened. Oh, that's heartbreaking. I'll say a special prayer for them tonight. The doctor nodded. That's a great idea. I'll also call my ophthalmologist friend and see if there's anything that might help them. The engineer, however, simply furrowed his brow and asked, Why can't these guys play at night? An elderly man had started to worry about his wife's hearing. Lately, she never seemed to respond when he spoke to her, and he was concerned it was getting worse. So he called her doctor and scheduled a checkup. The doctor reassured him. I'll see her in 2 weeks, but in the meantime, you can do a simple test at home to get an idea of how bad her hearing is. What kind of test? The man asked. Start about 40 feet away from her and speak in a normal tone. If she doesn't respond, move 10 feet closer and try again. Keep doing this until she answers. That evening, while his wife was busy cooking in the kitchen, the man decided to try the test. Standing about 40 feet away in the living room, he called out, Honey, what's for dinner? No response. He walked 10 feet closer and tried again. Honey, what's for dinner? Still nothing. He moved to the dining room, 20 feet away now, and raised his voice. Honey, what's for dinner? Silence. Now getting frustrated, he stepped to the kitchen door just 10 feet away. Honey, what's for dinner? Nothing. Now convinced she was practically deaf, he walked right up behind her and shouted, Honey, what's for dinner? His wife spun around, hands on her hips, eyes blazing. Chicken! Chicken! For the 5th time, we're having chicken! One evening, a curious young boy sat beside his father and asked, Daddy, how was I born? His father sighed, put down his newspaper, and smiled knowingly. Ah, my boy, I suppose you'd find out sooner or later. Let me put it in terms your generation will understand. The boy leaned in, eager for an answer. Well, his dad began, your mother and I met in a chat room. After exchanging a few flirty emails, I finally gathered the courage to ask her out on a date. We met at a cyber cafe, very romantic, mind you. The boy nodded, intrigued. Things escalated quickly. We snuck away to a private chat and, well, let's just say your mother downloaded from my memory stick. The boy looked puzzled. Downloaded? His dad cleared his throat. Yes, and before we knew it, I was ready to upload. But here's where we made a critical mistake. We forgot to use a firewall. The boy's eyes widened. By the time we realized there was no delete button, it was too late. And 9 months later, boom, you arrived, our little blessed virus. The boy sat in stunned silence, his mind spinning. Wait, am I some kind of computer program? His father chuckled. No, son, but trust me, you caused just as many system crashes in your first few years. And with that, the boy decided he'd stick to biology textbooks for his next lesson. A man heads out for the day, starting with a game of pool with a friend. While playing, he hears a Chinese man in the background shouting, Sooki Yaki! Sooki Yaki! He brushes it off and later heads to the golf course. Mid-game, he hears another man, this time on a different hole, yelling the same thing. Sooki Yaki! Sooki Yaki! Now he's puzzled. What could it mean? That evening, he ends up at a brothel. In bed with an Asian woman, things heat up, and suddenly she starts shouting, Sooki Yaki! Sooki Yaki! He can't take the mystery anymore and asks, I've been hearing that all day. What does it mean? She looks at him, rolls her eyes, and says, It means in the hole, stupid. One afternoon, a man wandered into a pet shop, casually strolling past the cages, admiring the animals. As he moved along, something caught his eye, a monkey with a price tag of $5,000. That's odd, he muttered to himself. Most of these monkeys are $500 at most. His curiosity piqued. He turned to the shopkeeper. Excuse me, but why is this monkey so expensive? The shopkeeper smiled. Ah, that one? That's our computer monkey. It knows Windows 7, Windows 10, Word, C++, .NET, app programming, and get this, it even fixes computers if they break. The man whistled in amazement. Wow, that's impressive. Definitely worth the price. He continued browsing and soon spotted another monkey, this one with an even heftier tag, $10,000. Now he had to ask, "And what about this one? What makes it so special?" The shopkeeper beamed. "Ah, that's our linguist monkey. It speaks 5 different languages and can translate fluently between them." The man's jaw dropped. "That's incredible. Definitely worth the money." Then something strange happened. The shopkeeper gestured towards a third monkey sitting lazily in a corner, looking half asleep. "The price tag? $20,000. Stunned, the man asked, "All right, now you've got to tell me. What in the world does this monkey do to cost that much?" The shopkeeper hesitated, scratching his head. "Well, to be honest, I've never actually seen it do anything." The man frowned. "Then why is it so expensive?" The shopkeeper shrugged. "No idea. But the other 2 monkeys call him Project Manager." For the first time in history, a human astronaut set foot on an alien planet. The locals, thrilled by their visitor, went to great lengths to make him feel at home. They changed all their signs to English, renamed landmarks after famous human places, and even rebranded some of their businesses to match Earth's culture. Eager to explore, the astronaut decided the first thing he wanted to do was find a pub. After all, what better way to experience a new civilization than over a drink? Spotting a nearby alien, he asked, "Excuse me, where's the pub?" The alien gurgled in response, but the astronaut's suit translated in real time. "Just around the corner." Excited, the astronaut hurried around the corner, and there it was. A neon sign flashed above the entrance, glowing in bright letters, "The Keyboard." Curious about the unusual name, he approached the bouncer. "Hey, why is this place called The Keyboard?" The bouncer, a towering alien with tentacles folded across his chest, gurgled back, "The owner is obsessed with human culture. He even changed his own name to match." The astronaut nodded, intrigued. "Where can I find him?" The bouncer pointed inside. "He's the bartender." Stepping into the bar, the astronaut took in the sight. Strange yet familiar music played. Alien patrons sipped colorful drinks, and at the counter stood the bartender, a stout alien with an enthusiastic grin. The astronaut approached. "Excuse me, are you the owner?" The bartender gurgled proudly. "I am." "So why is this place called The Keyboard?" The bartender leaned in, eyes glinting with excitement. "Well, since I knew humans were coming, I decided to update the name." The astronaut, now on the edge of his seat, asked, "Yeah? What's the meaning behind it?" The bartender grinned. "Because it's a space bar." The astronaut blinked. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said, sliding onto a stool. "I'll take whatever the special is." John was sitting in his living room enjoying a quiet evening when his phone buzzed. A message from his neighbor, Alan. "Dear John, this is Alan next door. I am sorry, buddy, but I have a confession to make. I've been riddled with guilt these past few months and have been trying to pluck up the courage to tell you face to face. But I can't live with myself a moment longer without you knowing. The truth is, I have been sharing your wife day and night when you're not around. In fact, probably more than you. I haven't been getting it at home recently, but that's no excuse, I know. The temptation was just too much. I can no longer live with the guilt, and I hope you will accept my sincerest apologies and forgive me. I promise it won't happen again. Please come up with a fee for usage, and I'll pay you. Regards, Alan." John's face turned red. His hands shook. His pulse pounded in his ears. Betrayal. Blind with rage, John grabbed his gun, stormed next door, and without a second thought, bang! Alan was dead. The second text message. Still fuming, John marched back to his house, poured himself a stiff drink, and stepped outside to cool off. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Alan. "Hi, John, this is Alan next door again. Sorry about the slight typo in my last text. I expect you worked it out anyway, but as I'm sure you noticed, my smartphone's autocorrect changed Wi-Fi to wife." On a breezy afternoon, a woman stood at the bus stop waiting patiently for her ride. As she glanced around, her eyes landed on an old-fashioned weight machine standing proudly near the curb. Curious, she dug through her purse, fished out a dime, and fed it into the slot. A small card popped out. "You weigh 126 pounds, and in 30 seconds, you will pass gas." She scoffed. What a ridiculous prediction. But before she could roll her eyes, poof, right on cue. Her cheeks flushed as she glanced around, hoping no one noticed. Astonished, she couldn't resist testing the machine again. Another dime, another card. You still weigh 126 pounds, and in 30 seconds, a really hot guy will show up and show interest in you. Her eyebrows lifted. Now this, I'd like to see. Sure enough, 30 seconds later, a tall, muscular, blonde-haired, blue-eyed man emerged from a nearby alley. With a charming smirk, he beckoned her over. Her love life had been about as dry as her aunt's overcooked turkey, so who was she to argue with fate? She strutted toward him, feeling like Naomi Campbell closing the Versace show at Paris Fashion Week. After an undisclosed amount of time basking in male attention, she returned to the machine, her confidence sky high. Another dime, another card. You still weigh 126 pounds, and while you were farting and fooling around, you missed your bus. Her shoulders slumped. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the faint vroom of the bus pulling away. She sighed. This machine knew too much. When I got home last night, my wife demanded that I take her someplace expensive, so I took her to a gas station. And that's when the fight started. The Social Security situation. After retiring, I went to the Social Security office to apply. The woman at the counter asked for my driver's license to verify my age. I reached into my pockets, no wallet. Apologizing, I told her I'd have to go home and come back. She studied me for a second and then said, "Unbutton your shirt." Confused but obedient, I opened my shirt, revealing my curly silver chest hair. She nodded approvingly. "That silver hair is proof enough for me," she said as she processed my application. When I got home, I excitedly told my wife about the whole experience. She looked at me and said, "You should have dropped your pants. You might have gotten disability too." And that's when the fight started. High school reunion reflections. At my high school reunion, my wife and I were sitting at a table when I kept staring at a drunken woman sitting alone, swigging her drink. My wife noticed. "Do you know her?" she asked. I sighed. "Yeah, she's my old girlfriend. I heard she started drinking the day we broke up and hasn't been sober since." My wife took a sip of her drink, nodded, and said, "Wow, who knew someone could celebrate that long?" And that's when the fight started. Steak and sensitivity. I took my wife to a restaurant, and the waiter took my order first. "I'll have the strip steak, medium rare, please." The waiter asked, "Aren't you worried about the mad cow?" "Nah, she can order for herself." And that's when the fight started. Honest compliments. My wife stood in front of the bedroom mirror, sighing. "I feel horrible. I look old, fat, and ugly. I really need you to pay me a compliment." I looked at her and said, "Well, your eyesight's darn near perfect." And that's when the fight started. Beer versus beauty products. I tried to talk my wife into buying a case of Miller Lite for $14.95. Instead, she spent $7.95 on a jar of cold cream. I told her, "The beer would make you look better at night than the cold cream." And that's when the fight started. Fashion critique. My wife asked, "Does this dress make my butt look big?" I said, "Not as much as the one you wore yesterday." And that's when the fight started. The late night panic. A man and woman were asleep, like two innocent babies, when suddenly, bang! A loud noise came from outside. The woman bolted upright, panicked, and yelled, "Holy crap, that must be my husband!" The man leapt from the bed naked, jumped out the window, smashed into the ground, tumbled through a thorn bush, and sprinted toward his car. A few minutes later, he staggered back inside, bruised and scratched. "I am your husband!" he shouted. His wife folded her arms and glared at him. "Yeah? Then why were you running?" And that's when the fight started. A stormy situation. Saturday morning, I got up early, dressed quietly, made my lunch, grabbed the dog, and slipped into the garage. I hooked up the boat to the truck and backed out, straight into a torrential downpour. Winds were blowing at 50 miles per hour. Frustrated, I pulled back into the garage, turned on the radio, and confirmed the weather was bad all day. Sighing, I undressed, slipped back into bed, cuddled up to my wife, and whispered, "The weather out there is terrible." She murmured back, "Can you believe my stupid husband is out fishing in this?" And that's when the fight started. Anniversary surprise. I asked my wife, "Where do you want to go for our anniversary?" She smiled and said, "Somewhere I haven't been in a long time." So I suggested, "How about the kitchen?" And that's when the fight started. Final answer? My wife and I were watching Who Wants to Be a Millionaire in bed. I turned to her and asked, "Do you want to have sex?" She replied, "No." I smirked. "Is that your final answer?" Without even looking at me, she said, "Yes." So I said, "Then I'd like to phone a friend." And that's when the fight started.